I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Size Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to a little big episode of Arcane Mark.
Welcome to Arcane Mark, everybody.
About playing with sizes.
So these are all sorts of different, there's all sorts of different topics to consider when playing with sizes. Why don't we start by talking about sizes that are sort of smaller than that kind of default small, medium level that a lot of PCs fall into.
Right.
And then we can talk about the larger ones too.
In D&D, Pathfinder, and a lot of similar RPGs, there are size categories for creatures that include small and medium and large. And typically, the default sizes of medium and small are essentially equivalent in most ways, with maybe some minor mechanical flourishes, but they are close to each other because of the fact that they are taking up one square on the battle map traditionally. Like, small would be like a halfling or a gnome or like a human child, and medium would be a human or an elf. And they traditionally have like the same amount of reach and space as each other.
So the same amount of space that they take up, the same amount of distance that they can reach with their attacks.
In some versions of the game, they like do less damage with their weapons, or can't use two-handed weapons, or
if you're small compared to, yeah,
or get other bonuses or penalties. In others, they don't. But regardless, those are kind of like the most normal sizes to see. So once you're smaller than that, if you're in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you're in the size of tiny. Now, in some other editions, there's also sizes that are even tinier than that, but all of those sizes share one quality, which is you don't even take up a space. Multiple of you can be in the same space. You don't have reach unless you're holding something long enough that it can reach. So those creatures are tiny. So when you're playing with tiny characters and monsters, you have to think about the fact that they don't have reach. So flanking, by default in the game rules, they can't because they don't have reach. You could decide if you want to like resurrect some component of facing to have them like sharing a square. One is on one side of a creature, one is on the other side of a creature.
Where you sort of imagine dividing a square into a 3x3 grid of smaller squares, and you say which of these spaces are you in so that you can flank.
Yes, if everybody in your entire game is tiny, like literally all of them, you might want to even consider having one square be tiny and using more squares for small and medium creatures, and then giving them extra reach. As if you're doing what Linda said and dividing out the one square into several other squares. Yeah, so if you're like,
okay, you know, if one square is like 2.5 feet or whatever, and then or one square equals 1 foot even, if you really want to go with that, and then it's like, okay, yeah, you're not usually fighting these large things, and if you are, they're just absolutely ridiculous. Yep. This also can work if the PCs are sized down very far. Like if you're going past tiny or past like the upper end of tiny, then you're gonna go
tiny by a lot. I think that's a different category of thing that we're gonna go into in the second half of the episode, based on our episode outline we discussed in advance.
Yeah, but I was saying like if you were even if you were like, oh, I'm half a foot tall or whatever, you could still use that.
Yeah,
sort of
I mean that's well within the range of.
I'm not talking like
tiny.
microscopic or other things like that.
Right. So if you're within the range of a normal tiny, which would have been like tiny or diminutive, or maybe some of the larger things that are size fine in the older editions, you could change the grid if like everything is. But it normally just works. Just consider the fact that you have to decide about how you're going to deal with flanking and certain other situations. You don't have reach. You can enter creatures' squares. So a lot of things and dynamics shift for those tiny creatures.
Yeah, and then you also have the thing about like tiny creatures riding on other creatures.
So in Pathfinder 2, there's a rule to prevent massive and rampant abuse with tiny creatures riding on other creatures, but in some editions there is no such rule, and so having a lot of tiny creatures can cause there to be an abusive taxi that does all of the movement for everybody.
Yeah, where like one person moves and the other characters are on their shoulder, and then like they all get to move at the same time for free.
Yep. Or even they just have some kind of a, like, throwaway thing that does the movement. And it moves everybody, and nobody has to pay for the movement.
Yes.
So, when you have large or larger creatures, the main thing you're going to have to take into account is making sure they fit on the map, in the room, in the location that you built. And
especially when they occur in large numbers, or they have abilities that might cause, like, larger creatures with split or other abilities that might cause them to create more larger creatures.
And think about, for a little bit, whether it makes sense that they do fit. For example, if you have a fortress of giants that was built by those giants to house a giant army, it better be big enough to fit the giant army. That was built to house a giant army that needs to fit them. Whereas if you have an army of giants that have, like, conquered a fort that was built by halflings, they probably shouldn't all fit into the rooms. It wouldn't make any sense for them to. They're probably at a disadvantage because it's hard for them to hold some of the rooms in that fort because they have to stoop down and they can't fit as many of their soldiers in each room. They may have to have a lot of people in tents outside of the fort.
Yeah.
So you may want to question the premise of whether or not you should have that many larger creatures in the first place, depending on if the room wouldn't make sense. It would just be like, yeah, this is a woodcutter's hut.
Yeah.
But I decided you were going to be attacked by 8 large tigers in it. And
it's like, how do they...
Maybe we shouldn't do that.
Think about things like hallways and doorways and how wide they are, too. Like, people aren't going to choose to live in places where they have to squeeze to get through the hallways and the doors and things like that if they can at all help it.
And on the other hand, a woodcutter's hut probably doesn't have 15-foot wide hallways, even if you plan to have a huge giant that was going to attack the PCs in the woodcutter's hut.
Yeah, so then if it doesn't make sense for that space, then maybe that's not the best place to have the encounter happen. Maybe the encounter should happen, like, in the storage barn or what have you, which has wider doors and then larger space.
Or if it
like
has
happen
to
outside.
happen there for the story reasons, then you need to think about the way that in the narrative of the world that this worked out. Maybe this huge monster knew it couldn't fit, so it, like, broke a hole in the wall that it uses to get into the room. It Kool-Aid manned itself into the room, and now there's a hole in the wall that the PCs can use to get into. And, like, the corridors are ripped open so that they're wider and this huge creature can get through. Because in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you can essentially move through a space that's, like, maybe one size smaller than yourself as difficult terrain. But if it gets much smaller than that, you have to use the squeeze activity, which is like contortion into a space that only fits your head, and it takes minutes.
Yes.
That's obviously not going to work. So if it's a large creature, it can go through those 5-foot corridors as difficult terrain. That's still a pain in the butt for it. It's
it would still rather not. It probably isn't going to have that in its layer, but you can have interesting encounters where that's a specific challenge that they have to deal against.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also considering with the space, what does that mean in terms of what combat looks like? Because even if you can physically fit enough large creatures in a room and you say, okay, the hallway is wide enough, are they taking up enough of the room that the PCs are going to only be able to have a few of them participating in the combat at one time? Then the room is still too small for what you've set up.
And, like, once the PCs and the creatures are in there, are they going to be able to move, or are they going to have to, like, all be playing that block sliding puzzle where the giants are like, okay, I know we don't have a truce, but we kind of want to kill your wizard. And we know that you want to have your fighter go up to attack us. So if you move one space to the right, then we could move one space down. And then there's one empty space, and then that'll move the empty space.
And that has big implications for things like area effects, too. Like, you know, it can be interesting to have cases where things are crammed and you can't necessarily use area effects. But if that's something that's happened consistently and the PCs have area effects as part of what they want to do, they might get frustrated. Or, like, if you have a monster who, like, a fair bit of their power budget is tied up in the fact that they have these powerful area effects and they can't use them without hitting their allies because they're all crammed into a closet.
Or a sardine can.
Then, like, yeah, it doesn't work so well.
Yes. And as you get larger and larger into huge and then gargantuan size, this only gets more pronounced.
And you also have to consider things like the reach and also how big emanations are around creatures, too. Like, how big is the aura around a thing that is ridiculously large?
5-foot emanation around a PC is not a lot of squares. It's still pretty decent. It's 8 squares. But a 5-foot emanation around a 20 by 20 creature is way more than that. I think it's 16 squares. It's twice as many.
Yeah.
Actually, it's more than that.
No, wait, because
it's 12 plus it's 18 squares.
Yeah.
So it's even more than twice as many. I forgot to add 2 of the corners.
So you've got that, and then with Reach, there's the change in the combat dynamic. How especially if the creature has, first of all, then the creature's
it's
engagement
20
range,
squares. It's even more.
I wasn't actually working it. I was thinking about the Reach.
Yes.
But anyway, if the creature's engagement range is going to be way higher, and especially then if they have like reactions that deal with people moving around within their threatened area, then that can quickly make things a lot more dangerous too.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone knows a Hecaton Kyries with its long reach and 100 attacks of opportunity is a huge pain.
And when you're talking about going even larger sizes, there's a mention from Kitsune where and sometimes the monster is the flip mat.
Yes.
Yeah.
So those are all concerns that you have to think about as the GM if your creatures are tiny or especially large. If your players' characters are, we said before with the tiny creatures, you could theoretically expand the flip mat a little. If your players' characters are large or huge, you're going to have to think about what you're going to do, especially if they're huge. Because if they're large, they can just be really uncomfortable and making it through the 5-foot corridors. But if they're huge, there may be a wide variety of places that they just literally can never go.
Yes. And if
you're it'd be this is 5 feet wide. I'm not going to say you could never go, but it will take you a minute to move 10 feet, so you can basically never go.
Even as a large creature, I mean, people who play, horse riding characters definitely have experience with it's going to be really hard to bring my horse into here, that kind of thing. And then if you're playing, a large character, and maps are not well-sized for that.
I think people overestimate that unless the GM is you can't climb this ladder with the horse. I brought my horse into lots of places with 5-foot corridors, and I dealt with the difficult terrain.
I'm saying it's something that you have to deal with regularly.
Oh,
yeah. The GM,
but
it's something for the GM to consider.
With huge, it's just you're done.
Yeah.
You're not going with the huge character.
It's definitely a consideration in Starfinder because Starfinder has so many large ancestries that are part of the baseline that you really got to make sure that I know, definitely with Starfinder Society, there's talk about, maps and things like that. It's we can't use the map with the 5-foot corridors because there might be 10-foot, there may be large PCs, and so, how would that interact and stuff like that?
Yep. And fortunately in PF2, it's just difficult to rate. It's not like in PF1 where it's you're squeezing now and you take a -4 to everything. And it's great. In no world is a -4 a fair thing to give except for PF1 where you may have +40 more than you're supposed to. And so it's only taking away 10% of that.
So these are some of the things for the sizes that are kind of close to medium. But the farther you get away from medium, the more you have to do.
We're even saying that huge, gargantuan, and tiny are kind of close to medium.
When you get to the point where things are just completely off there, so on the upper end, there's the monster is the flip mat level.
The kaiju.
The kaiju, yes. So one of the pieces of advice for kaiju that you'll see in published work is to consider that the creature at that point is represented more as a series of hazards and threats, skill challenges rather than combat challenges. It can
also be an environment, in the video game Shadow of the Colossus, where you're climbing on the monster. I mean, I know Linda knows that for no particular reason of any of her adventures that she's written.
Yes.
Don't want to spoil which one it is, but. Absolutely. The monster can be the environment. It can be a hazard. It can be an environmental hazard. Whoa! Our light just went out, but...
Looks like we're having a little power flicker here.
Did we lose internet? Somebody tell me. I think we didn't.
Yeah.
Wow, we only lost the light.
Strange. All right. Okay,
that's good. I prefer losing only the light. All right. So, it can be an environmental hazard where the environment is the monster, and it's like in Final Fantasy X where they're climbing on Sin and it shoots out all the scales at you.
You can have things where, the ground that below you is the monster, so the monster is rumbling. You can have, preposterously loud sounds or distortions or things like that to give the sense of the massive scale.
Yep, and even if you're on it or not, it can be... constantly destroying the town and you're trying to save people and get them out. It can be hazards. It can be a victory point subsystem or which could be a chase where it's the kaiju is chasing you. It could be a survival subsystem where you're making skill checks to see how many people will be killed by this natural disaster that is the kaiju. and the kaiju keeps doing its weird moves on its turn, and then each PC takes a turn to try to mitigate, and depending on, the kaiju did a fire breath, now things are on fire. Now that allows the PCs to take the, put out the fire action, which is one of the things that they can do.
So one of the main questions to ask yourself as a GM when you're constructing these is, what does winning look like? For something that's that big, winning doesn't necessarily mean kill the creature. Winning could mean survive long enough to run away, or
survive until it leaves.
Survive until it gets bored, or bother it enough that it decides it's tired of you guys.
Maybe it was just on its way through, and it wasn't really even necessarily trying to kill these insects, but it was just having fun
or
stamping
prevent
on
it from
them.
doing terrible thing X before, until the people who are creating the barrier generation ritual can get that up so that it's repelled from the town or something like that.
Defend your people, your armies, and so that your kaiju could attack their army.
Yes, because your kaiju needs time to warm up and charge before your mecha kaiju. You can do kaiju versus mecha battle. Yeah.
Kaiju versus mecha kaiju.
Yes.
So that's generally how you want to play with things that are just ridiculously big. You can also have a new kind of combat that uses a new kind of hit points, kind of like you were talking about with Kaiju versus Mecha, where you have something like Starfinder Hull points that are just so many hit points that, normally it would take forever to actually damage something that big. But they have this mega hit points, which in a way are kind of like a victory point, if you think about it. And they use their mega weapons that deal damage to these hull points.
Yeah,
or
so
Kaiju
if PCs then have giant, whether it's starship lasers or magic cannons or some other thing that's just completely over the top that it takes to damage them.
God's given ultimate divinity blasts, or it can be whatever you want it to be. They become giant divine avatars of their deity. It just depends on what flavor you want to give to them. But yeah, you could have the quote victory point system be a combat that is against a mega kind of hit point too. That's a way to do it, a way to handle it. The point is you blow things out to a macro scale, or you focus on a more micro scale and it's just this big thing that's encroaching everywhere and it's not a standard battle.
Because naturally, if the creature is the size of a mansion and the PCs are the size of humans or halflings or whatever, and they're attacking it, it's like poking them with a toothpick. It's it shouldn't really care at that point, which is something that you get into on the other end of the scale too with creatures that are ridiculously small. It's they're not really going to be doing things that are combat damage. So where you often see them represented is things like, for example, maybe they are a disease.
Yep.
Because they're a microorganism.
Super tiny parasites often are, or spores or things often are represented as a disease.
Or maybe
or another
hazard.
kind of affliction or hazard.
Yeah, or curse or something like that.
Yeah, hazards like the molds. So, representing them as a hazard or affliction makes a lot of sense for fighting off against something that's just so small. You can't exactly attack it.
Yeah, you can't squish it all, but it also isn't going to be able to damage you via normal means.
That's why I wanted the remove disease spell to have the death trait instead of the healing trait, because really what it's doing is killing these microorganisms. But that's nobody true. Else in all of Paizo liked that idea.
I like that idea.
Except for Linda.
I think it's cool because it's more accurate.
Okay. But nobody that I asked at the time liked it. They all thought it was terrible because they were like, nobody is going to think that except you for remove disease being death because it kills other living things that are inside. So, but if you want it to have the death trait, then you can, because that is a way that you can be killing off these super tiny creatures. Another thing to think about is what happens if the PCs are that small, possibly because they got shrunk down. This is a big situation where you really do need to change the size of the grid to fit the PCs who have now all been shrunk down to be super tiny.
Well, I mean, first of all, the PCs are then preposterously smaller than their opponent. So you could have something that uses that kind of kaiju inspiration while being a more typical creature. Instead of a typical kaiju, it's like a cat, and the cat is behaving like a kaiju.
Yep. Or maybe you've shrunk the PCs to a size such that the cat is merely a gargantuan plus that takes up a little bit more than the usual 20 by 20 space on the grid. I did that once in one of the campaigns I was running, so I could finally use my Red Dragon quote miniature, the colossal one that was Wizards had made that one time, and it was actually a pseudo dragon familiar. The PCs had been shrunk so small. The tiny pseudo dragon was the size of a colossal red dragon, and their damage was just brought to such a low degree that basically the pseudo dragon's hit points went up to be appropriate for the PCs who were much higher level, and its damage went up because it was so big.
So you can reflavor like more powerful monsters off of that, and then it's like, oh yeah, instead of a cat being like, level -1 creature or whatever a cat would normally be, it's like now a cat is a level 10 threat because
yes, a level
has
10
all these hit points and things like that.
Size.
And then you think about like what are things that a cat can't do to like a human but could do to like an incredibly tiny thing. Like, do they have like a paw smash at that point where they can crush things?
They could easily grab you, whereas not all the really small cats have grab.
Are they gonna like toy with you as they rip you apart? Yeah,
they might use you as a cat toy.
Yes,
there's all sorts of things you can do, and you can think about how even like mundane areas become a difficult situation, and the table is something you have to climb up. And
because altitude's a big part of it too, not just sort of like the space on the ground. Even with things like, for example, what would be a small puddle? What would be a small puddle for like you can just kind of wade through for a medium creature. If you're a tiny creature, then you have to swim, and then if you get
all
more
the little
and more
parasites and microorganisms that are in the puddle will probably attack you. So like any body of water is probably dangerous if you're small enough. Obviously, if you're large enough that microorganisms are a threat to you, it's not quite as bad, but there still could be parasites
or just like maybe needing to swim and like avoid getting swept away on something that would otherwise just be that's a little puddle on the ground, or like needing to stoop to go through areas like we were talking about a bit before with the other things, or like if something is made as a chair, can you get up and sit on that chair, or like. And what does that mean? What does that mean for sort of the environment? Like I think back on the the Storval stairs and Rise of the Runelords, where you have stairs that are built for giants, and the giants can just walk up and down them like normal stairs, but for the PCs, it's like grab and climb and things like that. So you might have climbing and swimming and all those kinds of athletic activities that are involved for dealing with environments that are built for creatures that are much larger than you.
You can definitely use something like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, or like some kind of situation with Ant-Man or other shrinking characters to inspire you for ideas of what to do when characters are super duper small.
Another thing to consider with variant sizes is what happens with cover. Like, if you are super duper tiny, you can hide behind things that wouldn't normally provide cover for larger creatures. Or you might find, for example, that a larger creature doesn't have any cover because for you, it's easy to shoot the top of its head because it's not peeking out, because can't hide behind things that most creatures would find to be cover.
That's true. Especially if you're ridiculously tiny. So small that an ant seems like it's pretty big compared to you.
Hi, Bryn.
So that is what you have to take into account when you're going obscenely small or obscenely large. And you can obviously use any of these tips in like the reverse way as well, if you need to. Like, if you really want to have the really ridiculously tiny thing fight the PCs and not be a microbe, you could theoretically let the PCs take these like Godzilla-sized super gargantuan plus minis for themselves and make the really tiny things be medium.
And then the really tiny things have like miniature death cannons that they're shooting
or
that
something.
Somehow
and then the fighter would be like, yeah, your reach on this grid is 6 squares or 5 squares because it's a 1 foot grid.
And then you might introduce when you have that kind of size disparity, cover is one thing, but also like tunnels and passageways can be really interesting if you have the idea where it's like, these creatures can duck away into these tunnels that, that the other side can't, whether it's they're much smaller than the PCs or the PCs are much smaller than them. So that the shape of the battlefield is different and gives some advantages to the smaller creature in that way.
And you tell the PCs is like, each square is 1 foot, so your step goes 5 spaces. And all of your movement speeds are multiplied by 5.
Yes.
And all your ranges and reaches are multiplied by 5. Like, they would probably enjoy being this giant mini on the map and having everything multiplied by 5 for like one time. Maybe not if like the entire campaign is fighting those tiny things, and then it just gets a little weird. But
yeah,
you
but
could
like,
always reverse these situations. Now, that said, you probably don't want to reverse it so that the PCs are a hazard and that the NPCs are rolling skill checks to try
to defeat them.
To try to survive the PCs,
because,
at least.
Yeah, because, I mean, sort of the idea that when you choose that something is a hazard versus a creature, it's not necessarily fully clear-cut, but generally a hazard is something that doesn't have agency. It just follows a routine.
Yes. So, if you wanted to do that, what I would suggest is that you could either talk about the settlements of tiny creatures that you're destroying as hazards, or like a swarm. Their army is like a swarm.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yes, this is an army of soldiers. They're a swarm.
Yes.
Or have them be hazards, or do a reverse of the victory point system where you are doing things such as like diverting like a tiny bit of water, which for them is a massive river, to flood them, or like throwing a small spark which burns them down, and like you're doing attacks or something on them to earn a victory points, or like maybe they have a certain number of points that indicate their city's like defensibility, and you're making it go down, and they are trying to drive you off.
Another fantasy classic for the other side, where the PCs are the one that's tiny, is sort of like the adventure inside the belly of the beast, or like inside of the body of the giant creature to find its weak point.
Yep. And that could even be
could be an entire dungeon inside of a creature.
It could be the dungeon ancestry with the like Leviathan or whatever it's called, dungeon ancestry heritage, where you are a giant creature and the dungeon is an extra dimensional dungeon within this weird giant creature that you don't control the movement of that huge creature, even though you're the avatar.
Mm-hmm.
So that's absolutely a trope and something that you can do. In that case, you're not really dealing with the creature itself being giant, but you are dealing with essentially things that are inside it, like its antibodies or other like other parts of it that in some ways is similar to if you were shrunk down and inside of a kind of more normal sized creature.
Yeah.
And that's a way that that same technique could be used for either you being very small or them being very large.
Yes. But back to the thing where the things that are fighting you are ridiculously small compared to you. You know, I can also imagine like visibility being a serious problem at that point. Like, you know, can you see them because they're so small?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there other tactics that they're able to perform in that case?
It's hard to target them if you make them be a swarm.
Mm-hmm.
Like their army. It's like army of dragon slayers. Our PCs are kaiju-sized dragons, and the army of dragon slayers, which is a swarm.
Yes.
It does a swarm attack on you, and you have to make a reflex save to try to like not get hit as this army of dragon slayers is swarming you. All with their holy relic swords for the gods to destroy dragons.
But you'd have to consider then sort of like, what does that mean in terms of treasure if you're so far off of the size of your opponents? Like, are you going to be like, I'm going to take this little bottle and collect all their holy relic swords inside
Yes,
of it.
if I do that and I grind them together into paste with the monster parts from this swarm of dragon slayers, I might be able to make one dragon kaiju-sized sword with the remains.
Yes. Or like if you're fighting preposterously large things, you know, what do you do with the treasure from the creature that is that ridiculous?
Part of the treasure is enough food to last you for a very long time. Like, I feel like that people ate they ate the biblical Leviathan just for a while. It fed all the creatures of the wilderness.
Yeah, so if it's like, oh yeah, you know, this creature's claw is loot, but like, how are you going to carry it?
Mm-hmm.
And that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for groups of how to handle that.
Yep. So you have to think about that in terms of size for sure. You already somewhat think about that when like a large creature drops a weapon, if it's not magical and resizing, it may not be the right size for another character, and that's Amiri's whole barbarian instinct in a nutshell.
Yep. Well, there's also things like, you know, when you're opening the doors, like how much pressure the doors designed for. Is it going to be challenging to open the doors of a place that is made for much larger creatures? Or like if you're in a place that's made for much smaller creatures, like are you going to be constantly at risk of breaking things because they're not meant for your weight? Because it's like, this thing is made for a 2-pound creature. Oops, I just stepped on it.
In a very early Paizo adventure path, in fact, can't get much earlier than that, there's a gnomish dungeon that's the first dungeon where there are all sorts of trap pressure plates that if you weigh about as much as a gnome or less, it will not trigger it. But if you weigh more than a gnome, then it will.
Mm-hmm.
And so it definitely mattered, like, what the weights of the characters were. So my minimum sized halfling, who thought of herself as being human, but was a minimum sized halfling because it was more of a sort of a gap if she was on the small size for halflings, definitely did not trigger the pressure plates, even though she was carrying a decent amount of stuff, because the problem with those gnomes when they were making the weight of the pressure plate is they didn't take into account people that were carrying a lot of gear.
Yes. So bulk's another thing too in terms of like how much can you carry to representing how much you carry, like how the way that like bulk changes for if you're super tiny, what, you know, then suddenly things that were dash negligible bulk or light bulk and so forth.
Yes.
And if you go even farther off the scale, then it's going to just go more and more.
If you're a kaiju, then you're determining how many people's houses you can carry.
Yes, exactly.
So there's definitely a lot of small things to take into consideration, but I think that we've shown that it's not as daunting as it may first seem to use very large or very small sizes. You just need to come at it from another direction. Don't always rush straight forward and think this is just going to be a basic battle the same way that I'm used to it. And if you do, then that allows playing with sizes to give you just a breath of fresh air in your campaign that can shake things up and make people think about things in a different way than they normally would with the like more typical situations.
Sounds good. Any other things you had to say here? I think I've got what I wanted to.
We covered it. We really went through this playing with sizes. So let's say goodbye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.